I want you to think back to the bosses that you've had throughout your career, whether your career is in the military, whether it's with nonprofit or with corporate America or corporate, internationally. And think about all the things that that boss did that made you think that they were a good leader and made you look up to them. Do you think you could bottle that? Do you think there might be a way to capture those lessons learned? Well, today I have Mark Fava, who welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Teresa. It's such an honor to be here. I've been listening to your podcast and following you for quite a long time on LinkedIn, so it's wonderful to be your guest.
Well, I'm so excited to have you. Very few people have done what you've done, as I was saying before the show, especially in the position as an admiral's aide. And a lot of people who aren't military don't really understand, as I was saying earlier, how intense and how much work goes into being what we call the loop, the admiral's aide.
Yeah.
It's one of the hardest jobs in the Navy. It's probably the hardest job for a junior officer. It is the most demanding. And to take and to capture different aspects of leadership through these stories. I just can't wait to get into it. So, as I always welcome everyone to the show, welcome to the Stories of Service podcast, ordinary people who do extraordinary work. I am the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And to get us started, as I always do, we're going to start the show here with a short clip from my dad.
From the moment we're born and lock eyes with our parents, we are inspiring others. By showing up as a vessel of service, we not only help others, we help ourselves. Welcome to S.O.S, Stories of Service, hosted by Teresa Carpenter, here from ordinary people from all walks of life who have transformed their communities by performing extraordinary work.
And Mark Fava is an author, speaker, and career aviation lawyer who currently serves as the vice president at the Boeing Company. His career spans decades in both the military and corporate worlds, and he served as an naval flight officer and mission commander in the P-3 Orion, accumulating over 3,000 flight hours. After 30 years in the Navy Reserve, he retired as a captain, having commanded 3 units, including a P-3 squadron. Beyond the military, Mark built a distinguished legal career. He previously led a naval national aviation law practice at a major law firm and served as chief operations attorney for Delta Airlines from 2001 to 2004. Now he brings a wealth of experience to the world of leadership and storytelling with his first book, Lessons from the Admiral, Naval Wisdom and Sea Stories for Leaders, published in January 2025 and already an Amazon bestseller. Today, we're going to discuss his journey from military aviation to corporate leadership, lessons in decision-making from the cockpit and the courtroom, the leadership principles in his new book, and the importance of resilience and adaptability in high-stakes environments. Welcome again, Mark.
Great. Thank you. What an introduction. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's my honor. So first off, as I always ask every guest, and I know a little bit about your backstory, but for those of you who haven't read the book yet, which I know you're going to grab a copy as soon as this podcast is over with, but for those of you who do not know, where were you born and raised, and what inspired you to initially join the Navy?
Well, I love that you began the show with a clip from your dad, because my dad was career Navy. I was born in Athens, Georgia, when Dad was a lieutenant instructor at the Navy Supply Corps school there, which is incredible. I had a brother and a sister, and we moved around the world with Dad in the Navy, including Washington, D.C., Guam, Charleston, just Hawaii, just growing up. And ultimately landed in Charleston, South Carolina, where we went to high school. And then I ultimately went from there to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in ROTC. And there, 20 some odd years later, is where I was commissioned by Dad, who was then a captain, and even better, was the commanding officer of the Naval Supply Corps School. So he had gone full circle from instructor to CO of the school, and he commissioned me at the University of North Carolina. I went on to do 6 years of active duty in the P-3 community. The last tour of that was as an admiral's aide for the lead East Coast P-3 admiral, and then went to law school after that. Stayed in the reserves for 24 more years, which was absolutely wonderful because I also could practice aviation law at the same time, and went back and forth between law firms and corporations. And the neat thing about Delta is I was there on 9/11. So talk about, really figuring out leadership and being under fire. I was the operations attorney there on that day. and then came back to Charleston and was very fortunate, 6 years after coming back to Charleston, when the current employer of the Boeing Company landed in Charleston. What a dream for an aviation lawyer to have the world's largest aviation manufacturer come to town. And I got the job, and I've been there 15 years now. So that's the backstory.
That is a lot. I mean, that is every time I get a guest on, I'm so enamored by all the things that people do and the things that people get into. What inspired you initially to become a lawyer after being an NFO? What was it
Yeah.
about law that drew you?
Well, it's exactly what we all learn in the Navy, right? So, in addition to being the navigator, communicator, and the P-3 at an early age, and then moving up to be the tactics officer or the mission commander, my ground job, my collateral duty was the legal officer. So the squadron CO says, "Hey, you know what? You're going to be the legal officer." I didn't have a choice. He just said, "You're it. Tag, you're it." The great thing about it was he sent me to Newport, Rhode Island for a 6-week Naval Justice School class in the middle of the springtime. And I said, "Yeah, I'll go do that." That's all right. That dude, it's nice 6 weeks duty in Newport, Monday through Friday in class was a heck of a nice break from the squadron. And I got back, and immediately, that was back in the day when we were big on urinalysis and big on the war on drugs. And immediately, we had a couple of positives, and I was doing captain's CO's mass, non-judicial punishment, the administrative proceedings, as you know, had a couple of small summary court martials, and I just enjoyed it. And I decided that as I finished that tour and went on to work as an admiral's aide, I had a mentor who was a JAG. He was a lieutenant commander JAG. Again, fast forward 20 years later, he would retire as a flag officer JAG. But just the power of him looking at me, and he recruited me to go be the admiral's aide. "You got to come up here." I can hear him, "Baby, you got to come up here. We're in Brunswick, and you'd be great at it. You'd be great at it." Good Italian guy named Hank Molinengo. He wouldn't mind me mentioning his name. He was a legend in the JAG because he was so wonderful. And I decided to do that, and then I started talking about law school, and that was where I went after that.
So, what amazes me so much about your story too is the fact that this book is so incredibly detailed. It has so many different stories of you serving with this admiral. And one of the questions I had after I read it was, does his family know that you've read this book, like his granddaughter or his daughter or his son or family members? And how's that been since the book's come out?
Yeah, it was very nerve-wracking, right? Because it did happen 30 years ago. The admiral is still alive in Norfolk, retired for many, many years now.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. And so here's where this story is going. As I was writing it, and you know this from your career, Teresa, I was like, do I may I and get permission from the admiral to write a book, or do I just write the book?
Right.
And leave out his name and change the names of all the family members. It happened 30 years ago. There's nothing classified. And that's what I decided to do. But I knew at some point along the way, I was going to have to tell him and his family. Now, his son lives in Atlanta and was following me on LinkedIn. So he knew, I was posting that I was writing a book the whole time, and he knew. So we got to the point at some point where I was going to, let him see and I wanted it to be a surprise to the admiral. I didn't want him to chop it. I didn't want to say, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Not that I was afraid that he was going to say no, but more so I just wanted to say, "Look, here's what happened, and here's what you did to me 30 years ago." So I kept telling his son, "Look, I'm going to share it with y'all eventually." His son and his daughter, both of which appear in the book, are now married with children. The daughter is a minister, which is a wonderful thing, because when I told her about the book, I said, "Look, there's about 4 or 5 curse words in there, and I know where they are." Because I was worried. I was like, "Oh gosh, there's," including one time I've got that old Irish guy, the P-3, using the F-bomb, and when I was writing it, I was very careful to try and be, like you said, detailed and authentic. And the editor said, be authentic and don't make it just a bunch of that, but just every now and then, if you think it adds to the story, put it in there. So at the end of last year, I finally got copies of the book. And this was right before Thanksgiving. I had a day off from work, like everybody does. Work was getting slow. And I've been talking to the admiral's son about going up to meet him. And he says, and the son said, "I can't be there." I said, "Look, I don't need you to be there. I just need you to tell him and the neighbor that I'm coming." And I booked a one-way back and forth ticket to Norfolk, got up at 5 in the morning, got on a 6 o'clock flight, flew up there, rented a car, drove to his condo, knocked on the door, hadn't seen him in, 20 or 30 years, and shared the book with him. We both, we both got a little teary eyed. And then we
He had
chatted.
no idea. And he had no idea that you wrote a book?
His son had told him, but I don't think the significance of writing a book is it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't hit you or anybody till you see it, right? For
And it's
everybody.
so professionally done, by the way. Like, and
Yeah.
I think you thanked like the designer and the editing team, but everything about it, it's just like I don't know.
Well, that was very important to me, Teresa, because I searched out a publisher that would publish a product that was fitting of being an Admiral's aide, right? That was fitting of what you and I know about the excellence of uniform and the excellence of,
Mhm.
the design. And so I gave it to him. We laughed and we sat on the sofa for a couple hours and chatted. And he walked me around the house and showed me, more of his plaques that he had gotten after I had left him, because he went on to be the CO of the, as a 2-star, he went on to be the CO of the naval base in Norfolk.
Yep.
And then he went from there to be Command Forces Japan, and that's where he retired. So he was showing me a bunch of his Japanese artifacts and the stuff that he got in there. Unfortunately, his wife has passed away a couple of years ago, but we talked about her, and that was it. And I sent books to both of the children, both of his grown children, and the most touching thing was both of them introduced me to their children, so the Admiral's grandchildren, and at least the son did. But the daughter wrote me and said, I just ordered 4 more books because I'm going to give one to each of my children so they know what their grandfather was like. I was like, wow. So that was I finally breathed a sigh of relief. I'm like, going, okay, the family's not going to be mad. They actually like it. They're proud of it. And they've both been phenomenal. And they've been really good to me.
Well, what also was really meaningful about this book that I found especially poignant was the fact that you had this manuscript in your mind, I think right after that tour,
Yeah.
or very close. And then you had just stacks of papers that you had saved. And
Yeah.
what did you do? Did you just set them aside in your home and then and always had it in the back of your mind that you were going to do this?
Yes. They were in a box folder like, most lawyers would keep, but in there were, it's a folder with fit reps, probably a folder with a bunch of active duty orders, all that
I've
stuff.
got all that. I got
Yeah.
a
So
over here
you've
with
got,
all that.
you've got it. And it really, at one point, it really worried me. I was like, oh my God, have I lost that? Have I lost those notes? The first notes were typed out on a first generation electric typewriter that had a floppy disk that was about this big that went in on the side, and you could type it and save it on this disk. They didn't even make those disks, shortly thereafter. It wasn't even a standard size disk. But when I finally found those pages, they were, yellow and brittle, and, they had the old, typewriter on. And what got me to do it was so much bad came out of the pandemic, but so much good came out of the pandemic. And this was the good that came out of the pandemic, because I was sitting around doing what my daughters do, which I told them they should never do. They taught me how to binge watch TV. So I'm watching Schitt's Creek and, all these mindless shows, and just because I'm just bored out of my mind.
Right.
And I finally, like everybody else, just scared, bored, isolated. And finally I just said, I'm going to pull that out and start writing. And that's when I started. It took me 2 years to get it done.
Wow. I mean, it's such an accomplishment anytime somebody writes a book. Like, funny enough, next week I'm also having a book author on.
Yes.
And I really can't wait to read her story as well. And she's just got the same kind of, I think, structure to hers. And it's going to be a really good read. And I admire people that take the time to do this, because it's not easy. And did you find the process also therapeutic? Like, did you find yourself reflecting on certain things, lessons that he imparted on you, and then how you've incorporated those lessons into your life from that point forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, as someone said once, I'm no spring chicken. So you get to that point in your life, you're like going, okay, what is, I know what his legacy was. His legacy was imparting his knowledge onto me. What's going to be mine? I know what my dad did. I can tell what your dad did for you, right? So what am I going to do, and what am I going to leave? And I thought, it would be fun to have that level of self-reflection, both in the book and, to leave a book. And, it is a labor of love. There's a great drawing that talks about, the cycle of writing a book. You start here where you're excited, and then it goes up to a plateau, and then you just take a dive, you hate it. It's work, God,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not unlike you publishing an article. Just when am I ever going to finish this, and how many times do I have to edit it, and and that's where most people drop off. They just say, I don't want to do this anymore. So the ability, when I finally saw it go from, I'm old fashioned, so everything was done in a Word document. I tried using other writing software, and I was just used to Word, so I just kept you. So I've got, again, Teresa, at the top of my closet, I've got probably 2 stacks with the big black binder clips on them of just edits, and where I would print it and then edit it. But when you finally, as I'm coming off that plateau, when you finally see the publisher put it in typeset, in PDF typeset, and page layout, pagination layout, that's when you're like going, okay, this is going to happen, and then I started working on the cover. They said, send us 6 or 7 pictures of what your vision is of the cover. I did. And then we spent about 2 or 3 weeks modifying the cover. And that's when I said, it's finally going to happen.
Right. Well, I think that as you did it too, and this is a lesson for anyone that writes a book too, did you start off with an outline of the lessons and kind of a chronological order? Because I also saw that it fairly stuck to sort of the timeline of, I think you were there for 2 years.
Yeah, a little bit less than that. Yeah.
And it stuck to sort of what lessons were imparted within those 2 years. And then each lesson has a representative story that goes with it. So I definitely like the structure of the book as well.
Yes. Yes. The publisher, I dealt with 2 publishers. The first one, that was part of it, right? Yeah. You first of all, you've got to figure out who your audience is. Because people will say, well, I want to write a biography about my family. Well, that's great. But, you've got to figure out, is anybody going to be interested in the biography about your family? Now, do you want to sell that book? Because if you're not, you're not Tay-Tay, or you're not Miss Clinton, people aren't interested in your life. And that's the wonderful thing. That's the wonderful thing about a publisher. They'll be very honest with you. They say, look, no one really cares about you as a person, but if you can give them something, think about it. When you go into a bookstore, you're looking for a book that you think will A, entertain you, or B, especially if it's nonfiction, will help you, right?
Yes.
You're looking for something that will give you advice.
Right.
So they said, put together these chapters, and I think I ended up with 18 or 19 chapters, but I probably started with 24 or 25. And we whittled them down, and we cut, and to get to where we were. And, they were, and this again from your current profession, they were very clear that every word matters, right? And then, at the beginning I talked about, all about how I got started. And they said, Mark, again, read my lips. Nobody cares about you. Stop. You've got to stop. Matter of fact, they said, we don't even want you to start at Chapel Hill. We want you to start in the Admiral's office, right? And that's where I started. And then I sort of go back. So it's
that's what I mean. Process. Like you had a really good editing team. Yeah, that's because I do read a lot of books for this show. And I would definitely say that, yes, that the way that this is structured and the way that this starts is definitely, it kind of draws you in. And they do things in the book that I think also really help you follow along with, just like the big headlines in the black font. And then you kind of go through the story, and each story is sort of just a bite-sized story of what happened, of what that day was like. So to give the audience a little bit of a taste of this, tell me a little bit about maybe one of the memorable stories that you hear the most that people enjoy from the book.
Probably we talked about one right before we got started, but probably the one I hear about the most is the toothpicks, right? So, I'm in the middle of this turnover, and my predecessor is saying, you need to do, it's fire hose, right? We all know how it is when you come into a new command and you're turning over with somebody. It's just, if you're lucky, you get a week, but that person wants to get out and go to their next set of orders or take some leave. So you're absorbing as much as you can. And he says, you need to do this. This person does the scheduling. Here's who you contact for air travel. So-and-so does this at the Pentagon. Here's how you set up conference calls. We're talking, again, this is, in the late 80s. So we didn't have a whole lot of technology. We didn't have iPhones for sure. And then he opens up his binder, his handheld binder, which we both affectionately called our brain because we kept the admiral's schedule in there. We kept all important phone numbers. And then he says, and I think you're going to need, I'm not going to need these anymore. You're going to need these. And he pulls out 3 individually plastic wrapped wooden toothpicks and he gives them to me. And he says, the admiral likes wooden toothpicks. Put these in your brain. And I'm thinking at that point, you got to be kidding me. What have I got myself into? And I don't know, Teresa, if it's just good old Navy humor and he's just, setting me up or not. But then he goes on to something that that he then says, now, when it comes to getting people lobster, here's the person you deal with and here's the person you call. And I said, lobster? What's that got to do? Now, we're in Brunswick, Maine. And what I didn't know at the time was a lot of people would come through on gas and goes to Brunswick, going over to Europe or to Iceland or wherever, or more importantly, going back home to Conus. And as they would stop there, what do you often do when you stop somewhere? If you got an hour or two, you'll go get a burger. Well, what you did in Maine was you got some live lobster and you brought them home. But the best way to do it was they would just call the aide and say, hey, can you get so-and-so, J&A Seafood at the time, to deliver lobster to the plane? And I had a guy that would do that. But the toothpick was probably the most favorite because I carried around those damn toothpicks for like 3 or 4 months. And, they're in my brain. And we're sitting on our first international trip. We flew a P-3 up to Thule, Greenland, and we're eating in an Air Force galley one morning at like 7 o'clock. It's cold as all get out. I mean, the wind is blowing. It's sideways snow. And we finish eating because we're getting ready to go get briefed at the Aviation ASW, Anti-Submarine Warfare Center, about what the planes were doing at Thule. And the admiral looks around and the galley's clearing out because, it's 7:30, everybody's going to work and we're still sitting there drinking coffee. And he looks at me and says, you don't see any wooden toothpicks, do you? And I was like, oh my God. So I reached over and grabbed my brain. I opened it up. I grabbed the individually wrapped wooden toothpick and I handed it to him.
That's
and he just looked at me and smiled. And he said, my predecessor's name was Clyde. He said, Clyde gave these to you, didn't he? And I said, yes, sir. And Clyde, like me, went on to become the commanding officer of P-3 Squadron. How neat is that? But that's probably the most, one of the favorite ones. Again, because it's not that you'd ever be expected to do that in the civilian world, but the key there is you need to know what the boss wants and likes, and that's going to be your measure of success. Now, he wasn't going to care whether or not I had a toothpick there or not, but the fact that I did, and I knew about it, that for him, he looks at me and says, okay, good job, Luke.
It made all the difference. It really does. Those little details matter because when people know that you've taken the time to get to know them and to understand the things that make them happy or the things that they don't have to think about. I mean,
right.
The way that I see an admiral's job is that they are thinking about things that are so complex, so big picture, and they can't be bogged down by these little details like the reservations or the travel plans or any of these other things. So there does need to be those people that are working those details. And if you can do those things and think about those things even before they ask for it,
yes,
you're so ahead of the game. And you've built your value. And what I liked about your boss too was that he never yelled. He didn't scream, which is such a, like you can say in the book, I mean, leaders are not screamers.
Right.
And he gave people, when they did fail, a chance to become better. Can you describe a moment? It doesn't have to even be in the book, but a time when you didn't meet the expectation and how he addressed that.
Yeah, I think, and look, again, this again was 30 years ago, different Navy, different times, different norms, different things. Doesn't mean what we did back then was right or wrong necessarily, and really can't be judged by today's standards because we didn't know then what we know now. So to say all that, to say there were back then there were screamers. I mean, there were screamers in the corporate world, there were screamers in the law firm, there were screamers in the Navy. So
I had tons of them in my career,
especially as a surface warfare officer. I mean, because that's why I didn't want to become a SWO. I've spent a week on as a midshipman on a ship, and I was like, ooh, this is pretty rough. Now that doesn't mean that there weren't some exceptional leaders who, like the admiral, never screamed. He would just look at me and say, you didn't meet my expectations today. Or this really disappoints me. And don't ever, one of the classic things he says, and I've got that a couple times in the book, don't ever let this happen again. That's all he needed to say.
Mhm.
And to your point, when something got to his desk, there were about 15 other people that had reviewed it and were unable to make a decision. And it was time for him to make a decision. He needed everything else to go flawlessly during the day. And that was my job, right? It was my job to take care of all the minutia. So when he wanted to get from point A to point B, he could focus on the big things that were on his head, not the minutia. And I was okay with that. He said, "You're going to see things that are well above your pay grade. You're going to see and do things well above your pay grade. You're going to see and do things well below your pay grade. I need you to do both exceptionally well." I said, "Okay, I got it." And that's just not the Navy. That's any job, right? If you get tasked with something to do, it's your job to be excellent in performance and execution. So I think, probably the biggest failure I had, there were a couple in the book, and I laugh about them now because for most of them, he would look at me and say, "I'm not going to fire you for this." And I'd say, "Okay." He'd say, because it's better to be lucky than good, and you got lucky
Mhm.
today. But I got the car stuck once with him. That was not fun. But the biggest one, which was just a really, oh my gosh, was we were flying back on a 1 week long trip and leaving New Orleans at what I called 0 dark 30. All I had to do, we had been at a conference. He had spoken at a change of command. We had been somewhere else. We'd been at New Orleans, which at that time was the headquarters of the Navy Reserves. We were getting on a little C-12 COD plane, a little two propeller engine Navy plane to go to Jacksonville for a change of command where he wasn't the speaker. So I'm like, okay, look, he's not the speaker. All I got to do is get him there as a guest, be in the right uniform, just show up at the right time. None of the details about being a speaker. Don't have to worry about who we're meeting. Don't have to worry about the sword. Don't have to worry about the speech. So, I say in the book, I got a little bit complacent, and, I just put in a request for the plane for the takeoff time and from here to Jacksonville. And I just said, okay, I know what time we're going to leave. And we're about an hour or so in flight. And the Admiral asked me, what time does what we call the pre-T before the change of command happens. So that's where the VIPs and the families get together in a separate room, maybe the wardroom, and talk and, small talk before the ceremony. And I can't remember the exact time, but I told him 0900, and he looks at his watch and he says, "That can't be because it's 0845 now." And we still had about another 30 minutes of flight.
Oh,
And,
no. Oh,
and,
no.
and I had no idea what had happened. I was like, what in the world? And then I realized I had completely forgot to calculate the 1 hour difference between New Orleans and Jacksonville. So we were an hour behind already. We never will forget, we showed up in Jacksonville, and there's a young sailor that had been standing there probably an hour waiting for us in his summer whites. And the Admiral was very nice to him, said, "Sorry, we keep you waiting." But that was another one where, and by the time we got there, the change of command had already started, and we sat in the back row. I mean, we sheepishly walked up to the back, sat in the back row in some of those white folding chairs. And at the change command reception after the ceremony, the CO came up to us and said, "Well, I was afraid you weren't going to make it."
And that's like the nice way of saying,
Yeah.
we're not sure why you guys weren't here,
Why
but
you were
okay.
here. Yeah, because he was going to recognize us in his comments. And the Admiral said, "Oh, we had a little bit of a snafu." He said, "But the loop takes care of me here."
Isn't that awesome?
And then he looks at me and goes,
Well, like totally like throwing you under the bus,
Yeah,
but you're the
yeah.
only one between you and him. You're the only two that know that he's throwing you under the bus.
Well, and to your
Thanks,
point,
great.
he knew I was already, getting ready to have an aneurysm the whole time. So I'm already sweating. And he waited until we got ready to leave. We got on the plane to go back to Brunswick. And that's when he said, "Let's not never let that happen again." Right? Because
Right.
in the first chapter, I talk about the initial guidance. And one of the 5 or 6 things he told me, very simple: "I like to be on time. Let's not be
Right.
late." You got it?
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
just completely blown it.
Right.
He
Right.
didn't yell at me at the plane. He didn't yell at me when we got to the change command. He joked about it at the change command ceremony. I didn't get a tongue lashing or a screaming to, but when we got on the plane to head back to Brunswick, he said, "Don't ever let that happen again."
And
Yes, sir.
those are the best bosses because you just don't want to disappoint them. You just don't
No,
want to let them down. You
exactly.
respect them so much that you want to perform. And I think that's exactly what that dynamic was there. And then
Yeah.
he knew how to hold you accountable in
Yeah.
a way that wasn't demeaning, wasn't condescending, wasn't
Right.
calling you out in front of a bunch of people, but in a way for you to know, okay, yeah, don't let this happen again. And now we're going to move on.
Right.
And I'm not going to hold this against you. And tomorrow is a new day
Yeah.
to be better.
And you know what? For the next, I don't know, 8 or 9 months, you know how many times I checked takeoff and land times and time zones? I mean,
Oh, I bet.
I talked to the flag rider who was a senior chief, and I said, "All right, senior chief, we got the time." And I told her, I said, "Every time we go somewhere, I got to know that I can never let this happen again."
Absolutely.
And it didn't. It
Yeah.
did.
No,
And
it's
you know what?
great.
As a corporate lawyer, knew whenever my time was to be in the courtroom. And same thing. I mean, that just carried right over to as a trial lawyer. I knew what time I needed to be where. Always double, triple checking everything. As a corporate lawyer, I knew what time the meeting started. I mean, I think that's just important.
Right. Were you inspired to go into aviation law because of your background in naval aviation?
Yes, absolutely. So I wanted something that, look, work is work. So, like you, we've got to find something that you're passionate about, um, and that you enjoy. So, for me, it was airplanes and the law. So, the ability to combine both of them into a profession, because you're going to work hard enough anyway, right? You might as well be
Right.
doing something that you like. And then, even better, hanging out with the people that do the same thing that you do. So, you can also talk to them about what you like.
Right.
Um, that opportunity came from me right before 9/11 when a buddy of mine called me and said, "Hey, you ought to come to Delta Airlines and work for us." And I had no desire to move to Atlanta. I'd never. It just came out of nowhere. He's a high school friend of mine, and I did. Took a risk, and we took my wife there, and we went there, and that's what made me an aviation lawyer. Because 41 days later, I'm sitting there. 9/11 happens, and then the aftermath of 9/11, I was at Delta.
What was that
And
like? Are you? I don't. If you're not able to talk about it too,
Oh no, there's some things in the book I remember vividly. That day, like all of us, you remember exactly where you were, exactly what happened. It was the most bizarre thing in my life. We were actually, if you fly in and out of the Atlanta airport, there's the Renaissance Concourse Hotel depending on which side you're coming in, off to the side of the airport. It cascades down, has a bunch of balconies that overlook the runways. We were actually in a conference room there, a large ballroom, having a conference. And my boss, who was the head lawyer of Delta at the time, we were giving an update to a group of our corporate security representatives. So all of the folks that handled security at all of our airports around the world were actually in Atlanta at a conference. They had left the airports and were there. And it was, 8:39 in the morning. We didn't have phones. We had Blackberries back then, but everybody had a pager. Everybody's pager started to go off to the point that we didn't know what was going on. And then the general counsel says, we're going to take a break. We're, assess what's going on. Then the reports started coming in about something, a plane hitting in New York. And like everybody, we all thought initially it was, maybe a small Cessna had run into
Mm-hmm.
one
We
of the
did. I
airports.
remember that.
Yeah,
Everyone
that
calls
was
a private plane.
yeah. And but I never will forget it. And this guy's name's on the back of my book, Greg Riggs. He was the general counsel at the time, another mentor of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And he looks at me when we were in a break, and he said, "Any idea what the weather was like in New York City today?" And I was like, "How would I know that?" And I was like, "Oh yeah." I said, "You know what? Before I got up to work, I was watching the Today Show, and there they were talking about what a beautiful. It's just weird. That's what a beautiful day it was." And he goes, "No cloud cover and no rain." I said, "No, sir, I don't think it was. I think it was the word we use, cavoo, is a beautiful day." And he looks at me and says, "That's not good." So he immediately knew that on a beautiful, clear VFR day, planes just don't fly into buildings. And then, because I wasn't too sure where he was going with that, but he looked at me and says, "That's not good." And then, gosh, we went to the emergency operations center. There was a time where we had accounted for every Delta aircraft except for one. And thank goodness that one finally landed. And that was when the last American plane or United plane went down in Pennsylvania. And then we went home, because the most bizarre thing was the Atlanta airport where I was working for the first 41 days. Every day, the corporate headquarters is right there at the runway too. It's just, you can always hear the roar of the jets. They're landing nonstop. And when I finally went back to work 2 days later, I remember walking from the parking lot to my office, and I could hear the birds in the trees. It was the first time I've ever heard of the birds in the trees because there were no jets. Nobody was flying. It was the most bizarre thing, but what a defining moment in my life.
Yeah.
Because
Especially to be part of the aviation industry at
yeah,
a time where something like that. I mean, our nation had never, ever experienced anything like that of that magnitude within the aviation industry. We've just never experienced that. And I think any of us who were around on 9/11, we can remember it's similar to the Challenger explosion.
Yes.
You remember exactly what you were doing, where you
Yes.
were, what the circumstances around your day was. I remember I was in San Diego. I was going in that morning. Actually, my father called me. I was renting a room in someone's home. I was just in my one room place where I was renting, and he just told me to turn on the TV.
Wow.
And he said, I just want you to know that there's been an aircraft that has hit the World Trade Center, or hit the Twin Tower, or hit one of the towers, because it was just the first one first that we saw. And I just remember kind of just being shell shocked about it, thinking, like, is what I'm watching on TV even real? And then trying to get on base later that day. I worked night check. It was like a 2-3 hour wait because they had shut the gate down for a while, and people were just sitting in their cars along the after the bridge to the road going into the base at Coronado. We were just sitting there like deadlocked, waiting to get on base. It was just a crazy time, and
it sure was.
That's remarkable that you were able, though, to parlay what you had done in naval aviation, and then by seeing the law community up close and personal in a collateral duty. And it just goes to show you, like, when we get these collateral duties, there are people who are like, oh man, I can't believe I got it. Tag, you're it. But I was the same way when I became the collateral duty PAO on USS Russell, working for Admiral Brad Cooper, who is still in the Navy. I remember thinking, like, this actually at that time it was Kilby. It was Admiral Kilby, who's now I think the vice CNO. And I remember thinking this was the best deal ever. Like, oh my God, because I was a communications major. I had learned about the public affairs community before I became a SWO as I was going through college. So I knew I wanted to be a PAO, but of course you can't go straight into public affairs.
Absolutely not. Right.
So you have to do something. So I was like, okay, well, I'll be a surface warfare officer then, and learn about, the Black Shoe Navy. I former AE, so I knew all about, the Brown Shoe Navy.
Right.
So it was just the coolest experience because I got to just learn about it as almost like an intern or a PAO in training. And I got to do all the MC, more of the photography and the graphic design and the writing of the stories. And that really helped me understand what was involved. And you got that same thing. You got sort of this legal training as a legal, legally, almost like a paralegal,
Yes, exactly.
as a legal officer. And it really helped you get into this industry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's called the non-lawyer class at the Naval Justice School. And that's what you are. You're just somebody to help the CO get through, mostly the captain's mast, the administrative separations, the page 13s, and all of that stuff had to be done right because it ultimately could be challenged later. But it's just like you, right? You become the PAO, you say, hey, this is fun. I'm passionate about this. And then it turns in, as I just spoke to a group of college students, and they were like, well, how do you know where you're going to end up? I said, follow your passion. A lot of it's process of elimination. Figure out what you don't want to do and then chase what you enjoy doing. It's easy to figure out what you don't want to do.
Well, and that's how I felt. I mean, I didn't really want to be an electrician. It was just, I wanted to join the Navy and get out of my hometown and travel. And then the Navy made me an AE, and I made the best of it. And I did my best, but I always knew in the back of my mind, like I wasn't going to do it forever. And I started just sort of navigating through the system and trying to figure out, well, what was the thing that I was meant to do? Right. And very lucky for me, I found a passion within the military that to this day I still love doing. And then finally it got to a point where I was like, well, there's more ways I want to communicate than what the Navy can allow me to do. And that's when I was like, all right, I got to start a podcast. And so here we are. I mean, that's really what this is this is just sort of another way of narrowing in on the thing that I love to do most, which is broadcasting and podcasting. And it is full circle. My father was a broadcaster. He was a DJ from 1960 to 1970. And then he became a voiceover artist and then did that all through my childhood. So, yeah.
That's neat. Yeah,
it really is.
We all have our stories. And I think that's one of the fascinating things. The more people I meet, is just to hear that kind of stuff. And again, just to see you open with your father, I immediately understood the connection when I saw the podcast the first time. I said, okay, I know that because I feel the same way about my dad.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really neat to have him as my first guest and to see what his influence and his way of storytelling and some of the ways that I can even see in my own personality that
Yeah.
I have picked up from being around him so much. I mean, growing up, he there were times in my childhood where he was the primary caregiver. And so I spent a lot of time with him, and I can, even my forgetfulness, like other, like little things like that. I know I kind of got from him because it just wasn't important to him. And so
Right.
I didn't bring it into some of the things that are important to me. So it's just very, very fascinating. Now, what was it like with the book marketing it too? That was
Yeah.
another thing that I really admired about what you did with this book in terms of marketing. Did you know a lot about public relations or?
No, but it's not unlike anything else I've done. I read about it and I follow the direction of the people that do it and do it well, right? So,
Mhm. You
and I've
studied
had
it.
and look, the people I've worked with, the wonderful thing about being an in-house lawyer is the people I work with the most, especially early on in my career, were public affairs people, our communications team, and HR, right? Because that's
Mhm.
when usually lawyers are brought in. HR, their potential issue, and communications are the ones that are going to be talking about it. And I never will forget it. Greg Riggs, the same guy I talked about a while ago when I first came into Delta, he said, look, he said, Mark, he says, you're a hotshot lawyer from Charleston and this, that, and the other. He said, but let me tell you one thing, you don't speak to the press. He says, we have people here that do that and they're good at it and they're professionals. You got it. And you will work closely with corporate communications. And that was neat. So on the marketing side, again, I've worked with an incredible publisher, Amplify Publishing Company. The gentleman who's the CEO is actually used to be started out as a lawyer
Mm.
and published a couple of books about college mascots. And now it's just, probably one of the largest hybrid publishers in the country. They have a package where, you can get somebody a professional marketer to help you for the first, or PR person really to help you for the first 90 days. And she just gave me a checklist and was very fortunate to be able to get me on a number of podcasts. And then I decided, just as I did with you, I said, okay, well, wait a minute. What are the podcasts I want to be on? Who are the people that I listen to, that I enjoy, that I think have a good following, that I think would be a good fit on? And you just pursue them with a passion. Then pick the social media platforms you want to be on. I'm still working full time. The full-time job and the family are still my top two priorities. And the book is just a hobby. But I do the book on the weekends and at nights and 2 or 3 in the morning when I
I
wake up.
love your post about the book and about all the different things. I mean, I think it's amazing. Like I love your storytelling sessions. Like when you go and you read the book at the library, or you're so community minded, Mark. And I just really admire that about you and about the way that you went about this book. You brought it to the local level and you made it into this communal experience, not just with the people on LinkedIn, but in your day-to-day stuff too, and in the speaking engagements that you did. So I really admire how you went about it.
Well, thank you. I mean, I enjoy it. I enjoy meeting people. I enjoy talking about it, and appreciate the opportunity just to be able to do it. It's just been a lot of fun, and it's I posted a couple of days ago. I finally got the book, and we were talking about this before we started, into my local library. But it's not easy because with self-publishing now, there's hundreds of thousands of books that are published, annually, every day, every month, every year. Just trying to get a book into an indie bookstore that's a small independent bookstore, unless you're with a big publisher, they typically don't even want to talk to you. So I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to go, like you said, Teresa, I'm going to go hand in hand. I'm going to go into that store. I'm not going to tell them my book. I'm going to hand them my book. I'm going to let them look at it, see it's real, see it's got, the IBSN number on the back. Tell them that it's with the number one distributor of books called Ingram. So I'm fluent in telling them that. And that's how I've been selling it. And, about 90% of the time when I go in and tell them, they'll type and they'll look it up in Ingram and they say, okay, we'll get 2 of them and put them on the shelf and see how it does. Okay, that's fine with me. I thank them and I leave.
I think it's great. And then you know what? The next thing you know, and I know Scott Mann is good about, he's also another great marketer, Scott Mann. And then you go and you see that your book is on the shelf in whatever place, and then you go take a picture of it.
Oh, it's crazy.
And then you
It's
promote
crazy.
it.
So my number one target for an independent bookstore in Charleston is a wonderful bookstore called Buxton Books. It's on the middle of King Street in downtown Charleston. It's right next to my place where I really wanted to have, and I was able to have my release event at the Charleston Library Society, which is like the second oldest library. It's now a private library, but it's in the country. Very, very historic. But, same thing, just when I finally got into Buxton Books, I went in there like 2 weeks after it was there, and I was looking all around for it. I looked under local authors. I looked under military. I couldn't find it. And the young lady says, oh, it's over here at the new release section. And I went over there. My book is seen right next to Michelle Obama's book. I was like, holy smokes.
Cool.
So you're right. You're darn right. I took a picture of it and I'm sending it to my parents. I said, not only is it in Buxton Books, but it's right next to President Obama's book.
It's great.
Because it was a new release. Now I went in there a couple of weeks ago and it wasn't there anymore, but they had moved it to another section. And I said, well, why isn't that section? Why isn't it over here on the signed author section and the local author section? They said, oh, we'll put it there. So, but
That's great.
But it's about those personal relationships, right? I met the owner of Buxton Books. Talked to her, said, gosh, I'd really love to be in your bookstore. It's you talk about storytelling. It's a storytelling book. Well, we don't do leadership books and nonfiction. But I said, no. That's the cover. You got to read a couple of chapters, and just keep selling. Don't take no for an answer.
Right. No, I love it. I love it so much. And it's such an inspiration. Like I said, it's not just the story of the book. It's the story of how you even went about doing the book. And that is a great point these days too, is that anyone can write a book, but you definitely have to still do all the work to promote the book and to build those relationships, to get the book read and to bring the stories about, because it isn't just going to happen. Now, how many podcasts have you been on so far since the book's come out?
Gosh. So on my to-do list is to write them all down and put them on my website. And I haven't done that yet just because they've come fast and furious. And they're so much fun because, again, I'm probably up to about 30 now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because it just came out right in the beginning of January.
January 28th. Now,
okay.
And a lot of them are nights and weekends like this. Some of them I do at lunchtime. But this one's wonderful because, it's also not only you do it live, but it's recorded. So that's just really, really neat. But even that has been learning. I was supposed to do one it's like 2 months ago on LinkedIn Live with a wonderful guy in the UK. And we did tonight on this one or any podcast. You get there early, you pre-flight all the equipment, you make sure, and everything with him was working until he hit the button go live, and then my audio didn't work, Teresa. And so here we are getting ready to go on LinkedIn Live, and no matter what we did, at 15 minutes later we just scrapped it, and I just so embarrassing. But he gave me the opportunity to do it again, and we did it 2 weeks later. We got on 30 minutes early. Everything worked within the first 2 minutes. He says, okay, what do you want to talk about for the next 28 minutes?
And then it's just like, oh, well, we don't want to get, that's another thing too. You don't want to be on sometimes those pre-calls too long, because all the good stuff that you were going to talk about on the show, you've now already discussed before the show. Yeah. I had a guest about 2 weeks ago where, oh man, and it was just his internet connection. He just did not have a good connection. And so I was picking up like every third or fourth word. Yes. And I thought if I got him on his phone, it would be better. I didn't realize that he was just still using the same Wi-Fi. So then I asked him to get on his data, and it helped a little bit more. But man, I was getting close to thinking I would have to scrap it. And luckily my amazing virtual assistant, Evie, who's actually on the call, she listens in on some of these calls as well. She was able to at least get some really good reels out of it too. So yeah, this is Evie right here. So I was very grateful. Yep. So,
well, but to your point, Teresa, when you send me a list and say, here's what you need to do, I mean, that's the same thing that the admiral would say. And that's the same thing I do today. So if you tell me to be on a wire, to use a good microphone. So I invested in the same microphone I used to do my audiobook. I think you've got the same thing. We got a Shure microphone, got Shure headsets. I disconnect the Wi-Fi. I plug the wire in.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't have any bandwidth problems. But I followed the directions of people, because when I didn't do that, it burnt me. And just like you said, there's nothing worse than being on a podcast and you're talking and you can look up and it's not recording, and you're missing stuff. And,
No.
and the podcaster tells you, look, if that happens, just keep talking, but it's still very disconcerting. So just follow
It's
the directions.
disappointing.
Yeah. Follow the directions of the people that are the experts like you at it, and say, okay, follow the checklist.
Well, and it's funny because the checklist that I send to my podcast guests has changed over the 4 years that I've been doing this.
Yeah.
So I used to be really, well, for a long time, I didn't have instructions. And then I realized that people were showing up unprepared, or they didn't this or that. And I was like, okay, this is my fault for not putting something out ahead of time. So now I have this list of instructions, and then I actually copied and pasted all the technical notes at the bottom from somebody else's instructions that they sent me to go on their show. And I was like, oh, these are really good. So I just borrowed them and tagged them onto the end of mine. And then I watched one where I thought the positioning of the two people with the headline and then this part here was really well done. And so I was like, oh, that's a good example. So I use that clip now in there, like position. And I never know if anybody takes the time to actually read all those instructions, but I try to do my best to ensure that the people who are coming on, because they're spending an hour of their time. I always look at like that too. Time is money, and it's valuable. It's time away from your family. It's time away from your loved one, from other things that you could be doing. So you want that time to be well spent, and you want it to be valuable.
Yeah. And I think the same thing about the person putting on the podcast, because, it's easy. I just show up and talk, and then y'all have the brunt of the work to put it together and to get it out there. So my thought is that if they're going to tell me what I need to do to be prepared, I ought to at least do my best to do that, to make it easy, easy for them, in the post-production, whatever. And that's just very helpful. And I did look at all your notes. And then the other thing you do is, you make sure that you've listened to their podcast. I've been on one where I knew every time at the beginning of the call, the guy or the podcast, the guy asked 2 questions. He says, all right, these are the 2 questions I always ask. Mm-hmm. And, just the ability to have that level of comfort and to know what they are, to know that your dad's going to introduce, the podcast, that is also very helpful.
Yeah, I started that. I had my dad introduce all the shows for the audio, and then I kept telling myself I'd bring in I'd do it for the video version as well, and I just never got around to it. And then this past Christmas, when I had some extra time, right around the time I hired my virtual assistant, because I had time to do that, I also brought in his clip, and I really like that because I think it frames the episode, and it also shows like that's the original reason why I started this show. I started the show for no other reason but because I wanted to profile people whose journeys and their stories were things that I admired, and I wanted to really dive deep into somebody's why. And I felt like once you know someone's why, the politics don't matter, the all those other things that we get so hung up on social media, none of that matters if you really take the time to get to know somebody. And Absolutely. So I wanted to provide a forum where people felt like they could really be seen, and their story would really be able to resonate and be used as a vehicle to help others with anything that they might be struggling with, or something that they needed some advice about. So as we're wrapping up the call, actually, what would you say were, I would say, maybe the top 3 takeaways that the Admiral imparted on you?
Yeah. One you've said repeatedly, which I think is so critical. Look, you need not to only know your boss, you also need to know your colleagues and your people, right? And we've gotten sometimes in a day and age where like, well, it's none of your business. You can't ask them what they did over this weekend. You don't need to get in somebody's private life. I was like, no. I'm going to ask somebody. I'm going to say, hey, how you doing? How was your weekend? Right? I want to know about them. I want to know about their kids. I want to know when they say they're fine, that I know they're not really fine, and I can pull them aside and say, hey, what's going on in your life? And then if I'm getting too intrusive, they'll tell me. But 90% of the time, I think what he taught me is he knew the staff from the Master Chief to me to the little E3 that stood, watch duty, to clip people in with their badge and their ID. We have some junior enlisted that stood the guard duty. We've all had that duty, but he knew him and he called them all shipmate, hey, well, and so that's what you said. As long as you're nice to people and you know them, they'll go to the end of the earth for you. That would be the first thing. The second thing is, like you said, grace with failure. grace when
Yes.
you tell somebody you're leaving them. And he shows that to me in the last chapter. And then I think the biggest one is just say thank you. I tell people in the corporate world and in the law firm, look, everybody wants great pay. They want great benefits and they want a nice quality of life. But gosh, if you just say thank you to people, I mean, just recognize people at every opportunity that you can. It makes somebody, even if it's been a horrible day. And for me, I had a couple of horrible days with him that were just miserable. And he'd just say, hey, thank you, shipmate. It's been a long day. Thank you for what you did today. And we'll start over again tomorrow. It's like, man, it just, you walk out of there feeling a lot better. So I think, and we did that, you'll see in the book. I would keep notes of all of our travels because he was insistent. Then when we got back, this was back in the day where he would write him, we type up a hand personal note on his flag stationery and we'd send the people who had impacted the trip and made the trip good for us, the people that I took taking notes for, a thank you note, a personal thank you note. To me, when somebody asks me if they can interview with me and I interview with them and, a week later, if I get an email from them thanking me, that's great. But gosh, if I get a handwritten note saying thank you, I'm just like, going, what a lost start that is, right? Now, I'd say greater than 50% of the time, I don't even get the email saying thank you anymore. And I'm just scratching my head. Like you said, gosh, you ought to at least, just express some bit of gratitude. And he was exceptional about that.
Yeah, that was a big takeaway too in the book is how many times, even if things went wrong, like with that front office guy at the hotel who you had to kind of have a little stern talking to, he got a thank you note.
Yeah, he got a thank you note. And it would be humorous because I would say, you made our check-in procedure so wonderful and start to a beautiful trip. And, that was one where I told the Admiral and his wife to step away because I didn't want her to see the collateral damage. And I was like, Admiral, can you just, and she's, she's breathing down my neck and he is too. And he just said, it was like the worst episode of Seinfeld. He just said, we didn't have rooms. Honey, did you hear they said we didn't have rooms? I said, would y'all just step to the side and then
I'm going to take care of this.
Yeah. It's going to get ugly, but I'm going to take care of them. The amplitude's going to go up.
But you made it happen, and you know what? You thanked him at the end of the day. Thanked them for his service.
Never make enemies, and I say win gracefully, right? Because you never know, especially when you're dealing with the BOQ or vehicles or anything.
That's great advice.
When you're going to cross paths with people again.
That's really good advice, Mark. And that's something too that sticks with me. I mean, I've had my share of haters over the years or whatever you want to call them.
Have.
But you know what? If I ever see them again, or if I ever have to communicate with them on something different, I'm going to be nothing but graceful and kind. Yeah. And one thing I have learned too, because I am held to such a high standard as a PAO, even in my off-duty communications, is that I'm never disrespectful, ever. I mean, so somebody can be just, I will stop engaging, but I'm never going to be somebody who takes that low road and goes in those places. Cause that doesn't, it's not productive for the conversation. So you're absolutely right. You never know when you're going to have to work with somebody again. You never know if the relationship is going to change. The relationship can always go in another direction. I always have hope that things can be better. So that's just the right way to live and the right way to be. So anyway, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Mark. Thank you so much. And if people want to buy your book or they want to know more information, where can they find it?
Yeah, definitely on Amazon. It's Barnes & Noble, and you can right there, markcfava.com is the website that'll get you there. And of course, as you and I mentioned, that's how we met. I'm pretty prolific on LinkedIn, so happy to connect with anybody there.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Teresa.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed this conversation. I will meet you backstage to say goodbye real quick, but I'm going to go full screen and do my closeout. But thank you again for joining the podcast.
All right. My pleasure.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. What a beautiful conversation. I have another author next week. I am going to be talking to Ms. Jean Abanez Payne, and I'm probably not pronouncing her name right, but I will get it right by next week. And it is Reclaim Your Worth, a story of abuse, empowerment, and building a life on my terms. So really excited to have her on the podcast. Been a really wonderful couple weeks of shows. Really always appreciate all the guests that come on the Stories of Service podcast. It is because of you guys that we get to do these shows and have these kinds of conversations. So I always like to close the call out with a call to action, which is very simple, which is take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And bye-bye now.